This is the third video in a short series on basic concepts in genetics. The first set of terms mentioned is what I'll talk about in this video. We're going to be looking at a couple different sets of terminology, and the main goal here is not just to understand what these words mean as like a vocabulary lesson, but also to see how those words relate to one another so you can see, are they two things that are different from one another? Is one bigger? Is one smaller? Are these terms a subset of one another? All those questions are things you want to think about when you're looking at these sets of terminology. The first set of terminology includes the words penetrance and expressivity, genetic and environmental variants. We're also going to be looking at how genetic and environmental variants combined help us look at the concept of heritability. Our second set of terminology includes looking at continuous versus discontinuous variation, the concept of having multiple alleles for a gene or a trait being polygenic, which can sometimes get confused a little bit. And then we're going to be looking at monozygotic versus dizygotic twins and the concept of concordance. Starting with the ideas of penetrance and expressivity, we look at these and they both relate to how a genotype may exhibit in a phenotype. Remember, genotype is the actual alleles that they have. That would be the capital T or the lowercase t that we were talking about earlier for a trait being dominant or recessive, if we're containing those ideas. And then the phenotype is what it actually looks like. I think phenotype, photo. So phenotype is what it physically looks like. Penetrance is the likelihood that a genotype will be expressed in the phenotype. I also like to think of it as probability, so penetrance is the probability. Expressivity speaks to the degree of expression, and we're going to get more into that later. Variance in phenotype can be affected by both the genetic component and the environmental component to the world around us. Variance in phenotype can be influenced by the variety of genetic alleles possible for a trait. This is touching on the idea of multiple alleles, which we're going to speak more about in a little bit. There's also variety caused by how those individual alleles interact with other genes on your chromosomes. Not just that one gene pair, but how each different gene pair interacts with the other gene pairs. Kind of cool. There's also variance in phenotype caused by environmental factors. So genetic variants are the differences caused in phenotype by the person's genes being different, and environmental variants are differences caused in phenotype by the actual environment around them. Some traits are more heavily influenced by one or the other. So some of them are more heavily influenced by the genetic variants, and some of them are more heavily influenced by environmental variants. And that brings us to the concept of heritability. Heritability is usually expressed as a single digit ranging from 0 to 1. If a trait has a calculated heritability of 1, that means 100% of people that have that gene express that gene. So heritability of 1 is very high. If genetic variance has a more strong influence on the variation in phenotype, then it's considered to have a high degree of heritability. So if a trait has a heritability that is closer to 1, then the genetic variance has more influence over phenotype than the environmental variance. When traits have a low degree of heritability, then that means that the trait has a heritability that is calculated closer to 0. Woo, that was a lot of words. Let's look at an example. The example I'm going to use for this is called camptodactyly. Camptodactyly is an autosomal dominant trait, and it has variable expressivity and variable penetrance. The phenotype for camptodactyly is a little finger that is bent and has limited mobility. Camptodactyly has variable expression in this trait. So you could have someone with camptodactyly that has a really slight bend to that little finger, or you could have someone with camptodactyly with a really bent little finger. This is also variable in the penetrance of the trait, meaning that just because you have the gene doesn't necessarily mean that you will express that gene. If you look at pedigrees for camptodactyly, it's possible to have this trait carry the gene for it and not express it, but still be able to pass it on to your future offspring. So questions you want to be asking yourself about genetic and environmental variants when you look at something like camptodactyly are to ask yourself, do you think this is more heavily influenced by the genetics or the environmental variants? Do you think it's a combination of both? Does this mean that it has a high or a lower degree of heritability? The next video will look at our second set of terminology in genetics.